When my wife and I were moving, we spent well over $200 on packing supplies. Everything from boxes to bubble wrap to plate and glass protectors to all the rolls of tape. With everything that we used for packing purposes, you would think that everything would have made it here and been intact. Sure enough, though, when we moved in here, we opened the box to find that one of our small bowls had broken into 3 or 4 pieces. So we did what any good American does. We threw it away. We said, oh well, there are still 7 others. We moved on, and we didn't give it another thought. Now, in retrospect, I realized just how privileged such an action is. Many cultures around the world, they don't throw away broken things. They fix them. They continue to use them. For centuries, the Japanese, for example, have made the mending of broken pottery an art form called Kintsugi, literally translated golden joinery. Now, this is a means by which someone takes a clear lacquer adhesive, mixes it with powdered gold, and uses that golden adhesive then to glue a piece of pottery back together. And the finished product then has now all of these intricate golden lines spread all over it. And such repair work is done for 3 reasons. First of all, not everyone has the privilege of throwing aside that which is broken and replacing it without giving it a second thought. So, if it can be fixed, it will be fixed and will continue to be used. Secondly, there is a belief that brokenness is a part of life, that those lines tell a story of the journey that that piece of pottery has gone through. And lastly, it's believed that the resulting product with the golden lines all over it is actually more beautiful than the original. Now, this last one is especially important because it applies not only to today's story, but to what was discussed last week with being the eyes of God in the world. And it applies to how we see ourselves, for that matter. So, let's start with today's story, which happens to be one of the few stories where Jesus seems truly angry. Now, in the reading, Jesus is rather aggressive with his wording. We would all agree with that statement. And there are a few different images that he gives with this angry rant. The first of them is wanting to kindle a fire that he wishes were already kindled. Now, when we think of fire, what do we think of? Probably not peace and harmony. As a pyromaniac, I'll admit, I love fire. I love to watch it around the campfire. I love to listen to a crackle in the fireplace in the middle of winter around Christmas time. I think that it's fun to light candles, light fireworks, but I also realize how dangerous fire can be. As someone who has lit a number of fireworks in my life, I have burned myself a number of times. Fire is not gentle. It consumes forests, homes, anything in its path. Fire causes irreparable damage to objects, animals, and people, sometimes even killing them. Just this past week, a United Methodist Church in Pittsburgh, not too far from the seminary I attended, was so badly damaged in a fire that the building was condemned. As mentioned last week with Sodom and Gomorrah, fire is shown to be a very powerful force. So, Jesus talking about kindling a fire This is not a soft illustration by any means, especially if you couple it with the other imagery Jesus uses. Jesus talks also about bringing division rather than unity. He specifically names turning fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, whole households against each other. This image sounds like the beginning of a war, of anarchy, of social discord, and taking into account that family systems were a very important part of society, arguably even what kept society in that day and age going. There is only further enforcement with Jesus saying this, that Jesus is going to cause the Israelite culture itself to come crashing down. So, cultural destruction plus the image of fire makes it sound like Jesus came to cause a second Sodom and Gomorrah. But that's not the case with either image. The division that Jesus talks about here is not meant as a means of destruction, but as a means of renewal. In that day and age, a father had responsibilities to teach his oldest son how to run the family, so that when the father died, the oldest son would take over. The oldest son had a responsibility to learn the tricks of the trade, to learn how to run the household. All the sons had to learn how to do the family trade. They had to make decisions for the women, not just themselves. Mothers had a responsibility not only to teach their daughters how to maintain the home, but actually to keep them chaste for marriage, to make sure that they are pure for their wedding day. Daughters had a responsibility to learn from their mothers and to maintain their own chastity. Daughters-in-law had a responsibility to the families they entered into to produce children, especially sons, for the continuity of the family tree. Every relationship that Jesus mentions has obligations, responsibilities, things that take time and energy away from doing God's work in the world and being in connection with the triune God. Should those relationships break, people would have greater freedom to do God's work in the world and to reconcile the relationship between God and humanity. This then leads to the purpose of the kindling of fire. The fire imagery used isn't in regards to Sodom and Gomorrah, but fire in regards to that of the Pentecost. On Pentecost, we read the story of how the Spirit entered into the disciples and tongues of fire appeared over them as they began speaking in all the different dialects and languages of the cultures that were present there. That division of language made it possible for unity to be established between cultures that otherwise had little in common, and also made it possible for the Word of God to be spread further and wider than it would have been otherwise. The fire that Jesus is talking about kindling is a fire of passion, a burning and passionate relationship with the one that Jesus calls Father. In the end, then, we have a world where humanity is in a relationship with God and doing God's work that has come out of a world where division, war, momentary obligations rule. However, this more beautiful new world can only happen if at first the world we are in is broken. Almost as if God, the potter, is going to break his creation to put it back together again in a more pleasing way that still fulfills its original purpose. And Jesus is just the one holding the hammer over it to make that initial break. I mentioned last week that we need to be the eyes of God, to see the world as God sees it. This means also not just seeing how it is, but how it can be. To see the brokenness of this world as a means to a more beautiful world in the end, and to see God as the potter at work, putting the world back together again, piece by piece, so that it might still serve its original purpose. I realize, however, that this doesn't make it any easier. We see the brokenness of our world, and it reminds us of when we have been broken. We see the injustice endured by others, and we are reminded of when we have been treated unjustly. We see chaos in the world, and we're reminded of the chaos we have potentially endured in putting our lives back together after a messy breakup or a divorce, death of a friend or family member, a major fight, mental or physical illness, or some other life-altering moment. However, these scars that I speak of, they are more than reminders of when we have been broken, of when we have been in need of repair. They are a reminder that though we may throw broken things away and deem them unable to be used, God does not cast us aside and deem us unable to serve a purpose. Instead, they remind us that God continues to hold on to us, even when we're broken, because of God's continuing to see us as useful in the world. They are a reminder of God's presence in our healing, of God's helping us through those tough times. And just as Kintsugi tells the story of a piece of pottery and how it got to be how it is, so also those scars tell the story of how we have become who we are in this moment. Lord only knows, my soul has Kintsugi lines all over it. But I wouldn't trade in my experiences for anything. I'm proud of who I am, just as I'm sure you all have some pride for who you are. However, we would not be who we are today if it weren't for being broken and hurt a few times along the way. Once we see our scars and what gave us those scars as a means to a more beautiful end, so too can we begin to see the wounds this world bears as a step towards a more beautiful world. But first, we must be able to see our own scars in that way, to then begin to see that bigger picture. So in closing then, I ask you all, as you go forward this day, what stories do your Kintsugi lines tell? Hi everyone, thank you for watching my sermon on Kintsugi lines. I think that so far in all my ministry, this is actually one of my favorites, so I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. God bless.